Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
I want you to imagine being in this incredibly exclusive, invite-only club.
Right.
And not just any club. Picture one of those dimly lit, wood-paneled rooms where, a handful of members have essentially been sitting around a mahogany table dictating the pace of the entire global economy for over 50 years.
Yeah, a massive amount of power in one room.
Exactly. You know the members, you know the unspoken rules, and you know there is this immense, almost untouchable power in sticking together. But then suddenly, literally without a word of warning to the outside world, one of the wealthiest, most influential members of the table just stands up, packs their briefcase, and walks out the door.
Oh, it completely upends the psychology of the room.
Right.
Because the remaining members aren't just wondering how to, cover the missing person share of the bill. They're looking at each other, trying to figure out who might rush for the exit next, and whether the club itself has even outlived its usefulness.
Which brings us to today's mission for this deep dive. Because yesterday, April 28, 2026, a massive geopolitical earthquake hit the news wires. The United Arab Emirates officially announced they are leaving OPEC, and the broader OPEC Plus group effective May 4.
Yeah, a 3-day notice for a departure of this magnitude is, frankly, practically unheard of.
It's crazy.
It really is. In the world of global energy politics, where decisions are usually telegraphed months or even years in advance, giving 72 hours notice is the geopolitical equivalent of flipping over the table on your way out.
So, to understand the sheer scale of what this means, we're drawing on a breakdown by Christian Coates Ulrichsen. It was published in The Conversation, and it's titled Cracks in the Cartel. We'll be using this analysis to sort of cut through the immediate shock value and look at the underlying mechanics.
Good.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the UAE suddenly leaving OPEC feels a lot like a key load-bearing pillar being pulled out from underneath a massive skyscraper. You can't just rip out a central support column without the whole structure starting to groan, shift, and, potentially fracture.
No, you really can't. And that structural damage is the core of the issue here. This isn't merely a localized squabble over who gets to pump a few extra barrels of crude this month.
Right.
It is a profound, undeniable signal of a rapidly changing Middle East. We are basically looking at a fundamental shift in global alliances, a redrawing of regional power maps, and underneath it all, the really loud ticking clock on the era of fossil fuels.
Yeah, that ticking clock is huge.
Yeah.
But to really grasp the shockwaves of this exit, I think we first have to look at the sheer weight the UAE carried within that exclusive club.
Absolutely.
And we'll look at the history here for a second. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, was formed back in 1960, and the initial concept was basically an international cartel.
Yeah, exactly.
The world's main oil producers realized that if they banded together and coordinated their production limits, they could artificially control the global supply of oil, which obviously in turn controls the price. It was a way to wrestle power away from Western oil conglomerates.
And the UAE has been deeply embedded in that machinery almost from the very start. Abu Dhabi, which is the specific emirate holding a staggering 95% of all Emirati oil reserve, they joined OPEC in 1967.
Wow, so way back.
Yeah, and then the broader UAE Federation joined when it was formally established in 1971. So they have been an integral gear in the cartel's engine for over half a century.
Right, so we aren't talking about some fringe player occasionally attending meetings.
Not at all.
The UAE is the third largest producer in OPEC and the fourth largest in the expanded OPEC Plus group, which includes major outside players like Russia. The UAE alone accounts for 12% of OPEC's total oil output.
Which is huge.
It is a gigantic chunk of the cartel's leverage just evaporating overnight. But I do have to play devil's advocate here for a second, because looking at recent history, the UAE isn't the first country to pack up and leave the club.
Yeah.
Qatar walked away in 2019.
Yeah.
Angola just left in 2024. So from the outside, it kind of seems like people leaving OPEC is becoming a semi-regular occurrence.
I get why you'd say that, but what's fascinating here is the specific mechanical role the UAE played, which is entirely different from the roles of Qatar or Angola.
Okay, how so?
Well, the UAE's departure removes one of the world's few major swing producers.
Okay, a swing producer. From what I gather, that basically means a country with a massive amount of spare, unused oil production capacity.
Exactly.
It's not just about, having oil in the ground. It's about having the infrastructure, the rigs, the pipelines, the export terminals, just sitting there fully operational, basically waiting for a switch to be flipped.
That is the exact mechanism. They are the shock absorbers of the global economy. I mean, you have to realize most oil-producing nations pump at their absolute maximum capacity every single day just to balance their national budgets.
Right, they need the cash.
Yeah, they don't have spare rigs sitting idle. A swing producer, however, has the financial stability and the physical infrastructure to either flood the market with millions of extra barrels or, on the flip side, drastically cut back production at a moment's notice.
So if there's a sudden supply disruption somewhere in the world, say a pipeline network gets hacked or a sudden war breaks out, a swing producer can instantly pump more oil to stabilize global prices and prevent those massive spikes at the gas pump.
Precisely. And without the UAE, OPEC loses a massive amount of its agility. It basically loses one of its primary shock absorbers. Yeah, if a crisis hits tomorrow, the cartel has significantly less physical ability to step in and balance the market.
Man, I understand the damage to OPEC, but looking at it from the UAE's perspective, cartels are entirely based on strength in numbers, right? Walking away from the table and giving up the protection of the group seems completely counterintuitive unless they've calculated that the cartel's leadership is actually, harming their bottom line.
And that is exactly what happened. The needs of the UAE have fundamentally diverged from the needs of the cartel's de facto leader, which is Saudi Arabia. This is the economic divorce that has been brewing beneath the surface for years now.
So this wasn't just a sudden tantrum over a minor policy disagreement.
Not at all. The cracks in this relationship were highly visible back in November 2020, and then they erupted again in July 2021. Both of those public fights centered around the COVID-19 production cuts.
Right, because during the pandemic, global demand for oil just plummeted. I mean, fleets of airplanes were grounded, daily commuting completely stopped. So OPEC, led heavily by Saudi Arabia, mandated strict production cuts. They forced members to drastically reduce the amount of oil they were pumping to basically create artificial scarcity, to keep the price of a barrel from falling to zero.
Right, but as the world started to recover from the pandemic, the underlying friction became impossible to ignore. The UAE and Saudi Arabia realized they are operating on completely different national financial models. They have competing visions for the future.
Let's break down those competing models. On one side, you have Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, so Saudi Arabia is heavily reliant on high oil prices to run its government and fund its ambitions. They need the price per barrel to stay at a significant premium because they are heavily dependent on massive amounts of daily cash flow.
Right.
We are talking about funding an incredibly lavish state budget, but more importantly, they are bankrolling these colossal futuristic infrastructure mega projects under the banner of Vision 2030.
Oh, like projects like NEOM or The Line, trying to build those massive science fiction style cities out of thin air in the desert, right? To eventually transition their economy away from oil. But the irony is, to fund the transition away from oil, you need mountains of cash from oil today.
That's the catch-22. To keep that cash flowing, the Saudi strategy within OPEC is clear. Keep member oil production lower, keep the global supply tight, and ensure the price per barrel stays as high as possible.
But then you look across the border at the UAE, and they are playing a different game entirely. The Emirati economy is already highly diversified. It's been decades building up alternatives to crude oil.
Yeah, they really have.
Dubai is a massive hub for global tourism and real estate. They have massive investments in global finance, a huge aviation sector with Emirates Airlines. Because they have these other massive revenue streams, they aren't living hand-to-mouth on day-to-day oil revenues the way Saudi Arabia is.
They have a financial buffer. I mean, they can comfortably withstand lower oil prices, say $50 a barrel instead of 80 or 90, if it means they are allowed to sell a significantly higher volume of oil overall.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the way I see it, it's like being at an incredible all-you-can-eat buffet, but you know for an absolute fact that the restaurant manager is permanently locking the doors in exactly 20 minutes.
That is a great way to put it.
Right. And Saudi Arabia is sitting at the table wanting to savor the meal, charge top dollar for every single bite, and basically pretend they have all night to dine. But the UAE sees the manager reaching for the keys. They don't care about the ambiance anymore. They just want to shovel as much food onto their plate as physically possible before they get kicked out onto the street.
Exactly. And the reason the manager is locking the doors is the global green energy transition. The UAE is looking at the rise of electric vehicles, sweeping climate agreements, and international carbon taxes. And they are terrified of a concept economists call stranded assets.
Yeah, stranded assets. meaning having billions of dollars of incredibly valuable oil trapped under the fan that nobody wants to buy anymore because the world has moved on to solar, wind, and nuclear?
Exactly. If the world truly transitions away from fossil fuels in the coming decades, any oil left in the ground loses its value. The UAE leadership realizes that the era of oil is finite.
Wow, yeah.
So their strategy isn't to artificially prop up prices for the next 5 years by holding back production. Their strategy is to monetize their vast reserves immediately. They want to pump and sell every single drop they can while a global market for it actually still exists.
And the numbers validate that strategy too. Abu Dhabi has been spending billions of dollars to aggressively expand its physical production capacity. Before the current regional war, they were pumping about 3.4 million barrels a day. But they've built the infrastructure to pump 5 million barrels a day by 2027.
That's a massive jump.
Yeah, and you don't spend billions building new rigs just to leave them sitting idle.
No, because sitting on idle infrastructure costs a fortune in maintenance alone. But here is the friction point with OPEC quotas.
Right.
OPEC doesn't operate with a legally binding treaty enforced by some international oil police. It's a mutual agreement. But if you cheat on your quota and pump too much, the cartel's heavyweights, mainly Saudi Arabia, can punish you by opening their own massive taps, flooding the market, crashing the price of oil, and crippling your economy.
Right, mutual destruction.
Yeah. So the Emiratis have been chafing against these Saudi-imposed constraints, forced to pump far below what their new infrastructure can actually handle. By officially leaving OPEC, they remove that threat of retaliation within the club. Without OPEC looking over their shoulder and capping their output, they can finally run those rigs at full capacity.
But wait, there's a glaring logistical flaw in the UAE's plan to flood the global market with 5 million barrels of oil every single day right now. You can pump all the oil you want out of the ground, but you can't actually sell it if the shipping lanes are closed.
Yep.
And right now, the primary shipping lane is an active war zone,
which pulls this entire analysis out of the realm of pure economic strategy and drops it squarely into the middle of a geopolitical earthquake.
To understand the timing of this exit, we have to look at the regional reality on the ground as of April 2026. Following the U.S. and Israeli military operations against Iran that began in late February, the Strait of Hormuz is essentially blocked.
Right.
And obviously, impartially conveying the events from the source here, regardless of where anyone stands on the politics of that conflict, the economic reality is that this specific geographical choke point, which at its narrowest is only about 21 miles wide, normally handles roughly a third of the world's seaborne oil. Right now, it is at a total impasse. The ships aren't moving.
It is entirely bottlenecked. So the UAE's grand plan to export 5 million barrels a day is temporarily frozen. But they're playing a longer game here.
Okay, how so?
They are simply biding their time. By announcing their OPEC exit now, they're setting the stage so that the very second the military impasse with Iran is broken and the Strait of Hormuz is secured for commercial shipping, they are legally and politically free to unleash that massive new production capacity onto the global market without waiting for a cartel committee to give them permission.
Wow, okay. But this conflict has also illuminated something deeper, right? It has exposed severe structural fractures between the UAE and Saudi Arabia that go way beyond arguments over barrel counts.
Definitely. The rift between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh is fundamentally about control. It's about competing visions for who actually dictates the future of the Middle East. If you look back to December 2025, there was a major geopolitical flashpoint between the two nations regarding Yemen.
Right. The two countries had completely opposing visions for security in Yemen. They were engaging in what analysts call proxy friction.
Exactly. Proxy friction means that instead of fighting each other directly, they are backing and funding opposing local factions within a civil conflict, essentially turning their own regional backyard into a chessboard for dominance.
Which is wild because we are talking about two of the most powerful Sunni Gulf states, nations that share similar religious and political foundations and are traditionally viewed by the outside world as an aligned bloc, actively working against each other's security interests.
Yeah, and recently their shared need to project unity in the face of Iranian military actions has sort of masked that underlying split. They've smiled for the cameras, attended the summits, shaken hands, but the tension never actually dissipated.
Right.
The UAE's exit from OPEC is simply that long simmering tension finally bursting out into the open for the whole world to see.
It really represents a pivot to a completely new worldview for the Emirates. The analysis notes the UAE leadership is actively doubling down on its own individualized national interests. They are prioritizing bilateral ties with the United States and likely Israel over their traditional ties to the older Saudi-dominated regional structures.
Because there is a deep psychological layer to international relations, especially in the Gulf, Emirati officials have been paying very close attention to how the international community has reacted to recent crises.
Taking notes, basically.
Exactly. They have essentially been keeping a ledger of which countries actually stepped up with tangible military or economic assistance when the UAE felt threatened, and which countries offered nothing but empty rhetoric.
And when they look at that ledger, the old alliances just aren't holding up. Abu Dhabi's calculation seems to be that there is zero utility in remaining tethered to an organization dominated by Saudi Arabia, especially when Saudi Arabia's primary economic goal, squeezing the market for high prices, actively hinders the UAE's goal of pumping at maximum volume before the green transition makes their oil worthless.
This raises an important question. If the two largest and wealthiest Gulf states are actively fracturing their alliances, and one of them is essentially declaring full economic independence from the region's dominant cartel, what does the architecture of a post-war Middle East actually look like?
It looks incredibly fragmented. It feels like we're moving away from an era of regional consensus, where organizations like OPEC presented a unified, monolithic front to the West, and moving into an era of hyper-individualized, cutthroat national strategies. So what does this all mean? When we zoom out from this specific 72-hour notice given on April 28, where is this actually leading us?
Well, the analysis points to a rather chilling conclusion regarding the broader regional architecture. The UAE's exit from OPEC might just be the first major domino to fall.
Meaning, if they've calculated that a Saudi-dominated OPEC holds no utility, they're going to apply that exact same ruthless logic to every other room they currently sit in.
Exactly. In this highly volatile post-war landscape, the UAE might very well reconsider its membership in the Arab League. They could reconsider their role in the Organization of Islamic Conference.
There's even discussion in the source that they might rethink their membership in the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC.
Right, which would be massive.
Yeah. For those unfamiliar, the GCC is basically the bedrock economic and political union of the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. It is the ultimate symbol of Gulf unity. If the UAE walks away from the GCC, the entire geopolitical map of the Middle East is completely redrawn.
It would be a total realignment. The traditional power structures that diplomats and economists have relied on for decades would simply cease to function in the way we understand them.
And this is exactly why this matters to you, listening right now. It is incredibly easy to scroll past a headline about OPEC quotas and think, oh, that's just some distant argument between bureaucrats that might change the price of my gas by a few cents next month. But it is vastly larger than that.
Vastly.
What we are witnessing is the real-time unwinding of a 50-year global status quo. This singular exit is going to dictate international security alliances, the flow of trillions of dollars in global trade, and the future power structure of one of those volatile regions on the planet.
The era of collective regional bargaining in the Middle East might literally be ending, replaced by a race to secure individual survival in a post-oil world.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over something that builds directly on the mechanics we've discussed today. We've talked extensively about the UAE's core motivation, which is that they are terrified of stranded assets. They are rushing to pump and sell 5 million barrels of oil every single day before the global economy transitions to green energy. But think about the basic, undeniable laws of supply and demand. If a mass producer like the UAE leaves the cartel's restrictions and suddenly floods the global market with millions of extra barrels of crude operation, the global price of oil is going to plummet.
Oh, it will become incredibly, historically cheap.
So here is the paradox. Could the UAE's panic to beat the green energy transition actually end up slowing down the world's transition to renewables?
Wow, yeah.
Think about it. If the global market is suddenly flooded with dirt-cheap fossil fuels, the immediate financial incentive for developing nations to invest billions in expensive wind farms, solar grids, and electric vehicle infrastructure might just vanish overnight. Why spend billions on a new solar grid when you can buy a barrel of oil for next to nothing? By trying to outrun the clock on the era of oil, the UAE might accidentally reset the timer, prolonging the world's reliance on fossil fuels simply by making them too cheap to abandon.
It's a fascinating economic feedback loop. The cure for high oil prices has always been high oil prices as it pushes people toward alternatives. But the inverse is also perfectly true.
The heavy wooden door of that exclusive 50-year-old club has just been thrown wide open, and the consequences of who just walked out are going to spill into every corner of the globe. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, look for the underlying mechanics driving the news, and we will see you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.